Here we go. One step at a time, don't be living on the line.
In our last video lesson, we illustrated how an industry such as that for consumer electronics in the United States could benefit from free trade with the rest of the world. You'll recognize this graph from that lesson, in which we showed how the world's supply would increase under trade, putting downward pressure on the price and thereby increasing domestic consumer surplus in the United States while decreasing domestic producer surplus and generating revenue for foreign producers of electronic goods. In this lesson, we're going to examine the effect that a protectionist tariff on the market for consumer electronics in the United States would have on that market, including domestic consumers, domestic producers, and foreign producers of electronic goods. First, we have to start by defining what is meant by a protectionist tariff. A tariff is simply a tax, and a protectionist tariff is a tax on imported goods aimed at raising the price to make domestic producers more competitive with lower cost foreign producers. It's called protectionist precisely because it is intended to protect domestic producers from foreign competition, and we're going to show how that would work using our simple supply and demand diagram for consumer electronics in the United States. So of course, the tariff as a tax is imposed by government. A government may wish to impose a tariff if it believes that domestic producers of goods are being unfairly harmed by foreign competition, or if it just wishes to favor domestic producers over those in other countries. So let's look at the market for consumer electronics here. What impact would a tax on foreign produced electronics have on the market for domestically produced consumer electronics in the United States? First, we should remember that a tax is a determinant of supply for a good. A reduction in the world supply can be illustrated graphically as a shift up of the world supply of electronics curve. A tax increases the cost of importing foreign electronics. An increase in the cost of this sort would shift the supply curve upwards graphically. So we can call this new supply curve the supply world with the tariff. Of course, a tax on imported electronics will have no effect on the domestic supply of electronics, since the tax would not apply to domestically produced goods. Only the foreign supply would be reduced. But this, in effect, has the consequence of driving the world price up to PW1. Imported electronics are now more scarce, and therefore the world price will be driven up. Now we're going to clean up the graph here, get rid of these colored triangles, and do a new analysis of consumer surplus in the United States, domestic producer surplus, and the effect that the tariff will have on Chinese revenue among the firms exporting electronics to the US before and after the tariff. So what impact did the tariff have on domestic consumer surplus? You'll recall that consumer surplus before the tariff was a very large yellow triangle. Now we can see that at the higher world price of PW1, the area representing American consumer surplus will be a smaller triangle. Consumers are made worse off by the tariff on imported electronics. American consumers are no longer benefiting as much from China's comparative advantage in electronics production. They will consume, as we will see, a lesser quantity, and they will pay a higher price for their electronic goods. Not only has the price of electronics in the United States risen, but the quantity demanded will decrease as well. We have seen that the higher price causes a movement along the domestic demand curve, leading to a lesser quantity demanded of QD1. Clearly the quantity of imports is going to be lesser now as well, but we'll analyze that in just a moment. Let's move on to domestic quantity supplied. How does this tariff affect the quantity of output among American electronics manufacturers? Well, as the law of supply would indicate, the increase in the price from PW to PW1 will cause a movement along the domestic supply curve, and predictably domestic producers will enjoy an increase in producer surplus. The new area of producer surplus among American electronics manufacturers is a larger triangle. Producers in the United States are clearly made better off. So the new area of consumer surplus in the US is the yellow triangle, producer surplus is the blue triangle. But we're not quite done. We have to show also that the domestic quantity supplied is increased to QS1, leaving less electronic imports left over for Chinese manufacturers. Since domestic quantity demanded is now QD1 and quantity supplied is QS1, the quantity of imports has fallen. What about Chinese producers? How much revenue will they enjoy now? Recall that previously the area of revenue was a large purple rectangle. Well, now the area of producer revenue in China is going to be a smaller purple rectangle. Since only QS1 to QD1 electronics will be imported, and the world price of PW is what Chinese producers will receive, the area of Chinese producer revenue is now a smaller rectangle. So Chinese producer revenue is now much less. Chinese producers are definitely worse off. Now that leaves us with a few areas that used to be included in total welfare, which we must still analyze. What about the tax revenue? Of course, this tariff is a tax, so tax revenue must be generated. Well, let's look at the quantity of imports and determine how much tax is being paid on each import. We know that the tax shifted the supply curve up, indicating that the amount of the tax is the vertical distance between the original world supply curve and the new world supply curve. So the per unit tax is the distance between the two supply curves, and the quantity of units that will be taxed is the number of imports. So we can see that there will be an area of tax revenue represented by the per unit tax multiplied by the number of units that will be taxed. So the green rectangle on our graph represents government tax revenue. The United States government, which has levied this tax on imports, will enjoy an area of tax revenue. So what does that leave us with? Where are we compared to before the tariff was levied? Well, we have two white triangles left on a graph that have not been identified. We're going to do that now. Let's look at these two triangles and determine what do these two triangles represent. You'll recall that before the tariff was imposed, the two triangles that I am filling in with black marks here used to be included in the domestic consumer surplus. Because consumers enjoyed a lower price, they had a larger area of consumer surplus, and these two areas were included in that. But now these two areas are the loss of total welfare. Another word for that is dead weight loss. Earlier in the course, when we studied microeconomics, we illustrated the effect of an excise tax on the market for a particular good. And we always showed that an excise tax led to a deadweight loss, a loss of total welfare in a market in which the tax is levied. Well, that's the case for an import tariff as well. A protectionist tariff aimed at raising the price of imported goods to benefit domestic producers will do just that. It will benefit domestic producers, as we have shown by the increase in producer surplus in this market for consumer electronics. However, the decrease in consumer surplus will be greater than the increase in producer surplus, indicating that the net effect on total welfare will be negative. Tax revenue is generated, so that cannot be considered deadweight loss. That tax revenue will remain within the U.S. economy and can be used to provide goods or services to the American people on behalf of the government. However, despite the increase in tax revenue and the increase in producer surplus, the overall effect of the protectionist tariff will be negative. The two black triangles represent the deadweight loss of the protectionist tariff. The tariff reduces efficiency in the market for electronics in the United States. Despite the fact that more electronics are being produced, American producers are no longer forced to compete with the Chinese producers who had the comparative advantage. They're able to produce more, but they're doing so at a higher cost to society in the form of less consumer surplus. So that wraps up this lesson. We have shown that a protectionist tariff is ultimately inefficient and leads to more harm than good in the case of consumer electronics, at least. As we can see, the cost of a protectionist tariff to consumers will outweigh the benefit to producers.